So, I'm still on summer break and I still want to talk about history, and I also want to talk about one of my other favorite things, which happens to be, well, elephants. And this elephant has a really interesting part to play in history, but it's not one of those things you really get to cover in the classroom. It's kind of one of those things that probably wouldn't show up on a standardized test, but nonetheless, I still enjoy this part of history. And this is the story, or an explanation of who Abul Abbas was. He was an elephant that was sent to Charlemagne by the Abbasid Caliph, Harun al-Rashid. And he remains one of the strangest and probably one of the most memorable diplomatic gifts that was ever given in history, especially in medieval history. Now, this particular elephant probably arrived in the Frankish Empire around the year 802 CE, and he had been brought from the Eastern Mediterranean by one of Charlemagne's envoys. His name was Isaac the Jew. Now, that alone makes the story pretty, remarkable. We're living in an age then that, long distance diplomacy it moved rather slowly. And it was also more symbolic. It was about having a presence. And the elephant as a gift, Abul Abbas, wasn't just some type of exotic curiosity. It was really about a statement about, power and political reach, and then the contact that existed between two of the great political worlds of the early medieval period. You have the Carolingian Empire in what was now France, and you had the Abbasid Caliphate. Now, what makes Abul Abbas kind of historically important is that he really points to a larger story than his own. I could have easily made a video and say, did you know that Charlemagne had a pet elephant? And then just left it at that. But when it comes down to the history part of it, Charlemagne and Harun al-Rashid were never really allies in a political sense, in the modern sense either. But both of these rulers had reasons to maintain contact between each other. And so the exchange of gifts and envoys and diplomats, and also the propping up of their own prestige, really helped reinforce each of their standing. And it suggested that the Carolingian court was part of a wider diplomatic world that stretched beyond Western Europe's boundaries. And so in that sense, Abul Abbas matters because he makes medieval globalization, if that's a thing, really feel kind of visible. He is proof that early medieval Europe was not like walled off from the broader Afro-Eurasian world, even if those connections were limited and rather elite. But the main source to this story of Abul Abbas is a work called the Royal Frankish Annals. Now, there's a Latin title for it, and I'm not even going to attempt it. But this particular work happens to mention the arrival of Abul Abbas, and later on it mentions his death. And that matters because the elephant is not really just some type of legend that had been conjured. He appears in a contemporary court source. Even though the details are rather sparse, they're still there. There's a record of it. And the Frankish annals suggest that Abul Abbas would later accompany Charlemagne and his army into the north. I think they're making their way towards Denmark. And he would die during this campaign in the year 810 or so. And probably around the lower Rhine River. And that detail really gives the story kind of an odd afterlife, because the same elephant that began as an extraordinary diplomatic gift from Baghdad ended up moving through the political and military world of Charlemagne, of the Carolingian Empire. And so what gives Abul Abbas, the ability to last throughout history is that he really condenses a huge amount of history into, just really one unforgettable image. And he reminds us that Charlemagne's world wasn't just made up of castles and monasteries and his campaigns and wars in Western Europe. The Carolingian Empire was also touched by the Mediterranean world and the Islamic world, and that long-distance politics that had an element of prestige and exchange existed between these different worlds. Oftentimes we learn history in high school, everything feels compartmentalized, and we don't really see how we have bridges from one civilization or one culture to the next. And nothing really exists in those little compartments, in those vacuums. And so that's why the story of Abul Abbas really it matters. Well, at least, it matters to me, because it really sounds kind of whimsical at first, like and elephants in France, but it's really something much bigger. It's about diplomacy and empire and cultural contact, the cultural diffusion that takes place that you learn about in geography class, and then also there's this surprising reach of the medieval world just beyond their borders and their walls out into the rest of the world as well. So anyway, I first learned about this story when I was back in college. Shout out to Tony in my European history classes, but Professor Tony. But anyway, if I remember right, there was like this anecdote that they actually fed the elephant roast beef because they really weren't sure what it would eat. Now, I find that hard to believe, because if Isaac the Jew is going to accompany this thing all the way from Southwest Asia into what is now France, they had to have known what to feed it. I mean, it would have traveled along the northern coast of Africa. They would have probably taken a land journey for quite some time, and I just can't see them giving the elephant roast meat the entire time. But anywho, thanks for taking the time and spending this one with me.